Welcome, listeners, to the Midnight Screen Files. There's a forest out there, ancient and alive in ways we cannot understand. It whispers to those who enter, luring them with the promise of escape, only to ensnare them in its roots. Tonight, we journey into Morrow Woods, a place where the line between the ordinary and the otherworldly vanishes like footprints in the soil. Two stories, two encounters, but one inescapable truth. Not everyone who enters the forest will make it out. Welcome to the shadows beneath the trees. The Screaming Trees. I couldn't remember the last time I'd had a day off without worrying about emails. As we trudged through the forest, my boots crunching against leaves, I realized this was the first time in years I'd been unplugged from my job. That didn't mean I wasn't thinking about it. The mountain of unfinished projects loomed in my mind like the dark clouds overhead. "You look like you're at a funeral," Holden said, glancing back at me with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. His backpack sagged on one shoulder, but he carried himself with the kind of energy that only came after a breakup. Restless, reckless, and tinged with self-destruction. "Feels like one," I muttered, adjusting my pack. "Except I'm burying my will to live instead of someone else." Holden barked a laugh. "Man, you're really leaning into the misery vibe, huh? That's why we're out here. Fresh air, no cell service, and a chance to clear our heads. You know, therapy." "Is this therapy for you or for me?" I shot back. "Both," he admitted. "You hate your job. I hate my ex. The woods are neutral ground. Deal with it." I couldn't argue with that. We'd grown up together, but adult life had driven a wedge between us. Holden had been a go-getter, the life of every party, while I'd settled into a monotonous cycle of corporate hell. When his relationship imploded and I hit my breaking point at work, we'd somehow decided this trip would fix us. Or at least distract us. The forest around us was dense. The kind of place where sunlight barely touched the ground. The air was damp, carrying the faint scent of moss and decay. According to the map, we were deep in Morrow Woods, a stretch of wilderness infamous for its legends. The locals called it the Forest of Screams. "So what's the deal with this place?" I asked, trying to lighten the mood. "You said something about a legend." Holden's grin returned, a little sharper this time. "Oh, you're in for a treat. Legend has it the forest was cursed centuries ago by a group of settlers. They chopped down trees to build their town, and the forest got pissed, started screaming at night, scaring everyone off. Supposedly, the trees absorb the souls of anyone who dies here. That's why the screams sound human." "That's comforting, right?" Holden said, clearly enjoying my discomfort. "They say if you hear the trees scream, you're already marked, and if you try to leave, the forest keeps pulling you back." "Sounds like a tourist trap story," I said, though I couldn't shake the chill creeping up my spine. "Or something you'd tell kids to keep them out of the woods." "Maybe," he said, his tone suddenly serious. "But people have gone missing here. That part's real." We walked in silence for a while after that, the forest swallowing the sound of our footsteps. Every rustle of leaves felt amplified, and the distant calls of birds had an eerie, hollow quality. By the time we reached a clearing to set up camp, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gray and orange. The fire crackled between us, its warmth doing little to dispel the unease that had settled in. Holden leaned back against a log, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. "So what's your plan?" he asked suddenly. "What plan?" "Your life plan," he said, gesturing vaguely with his mug of instant coffee. "Are you going to stay in that job forever, or are you finally going to jump ship?" I stared into the fire, the flames blurring as my thoughts spiraled. "I don't know. Quitting feels like failing, but staying feels like slowly dying. It's like choosing between drowning and burning." "Damn, dude," Holden said, shaking his head. "You need this trip more than I thought." "What about you?" I countered. "What's your plan now that you're single?" His expression darkened and he shrugged. "No idea. Just trying to survive, I guess." Before I could respond, a sound cut through the stillness of the night, a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't the wind, it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. My skin prickled. "What the hell was that?" I whispered. Holden sat up, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. "Probably an animal," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. The wail came again. Louder this time, and it was unmistakably human. My breath hitched as I realized it sounded like someone screaming in agony. "You still think it's an animal?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Holden didn't answer. He grabbed a flashlight and stood, his movements tense. "Stay here, I'll check it out." "Like hell you will," I said, grabbing my own flashlight. "We're not splitting up." Reluctantly, he nodded, and we ventured into the darkness together. The forest seemed alive, the trees closing in around us as we moved further from the fire. The screaming grew louder, echoing from all directions. My heart pounded in my chest as shadows danced in the beam of my flashlight. "This is insane," I muttered. "What if someone's hurt?" "Or it's a trap," Holden said grimly. We reached a grove of gnarled trees, their twisted branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The screaming abruptly stopped, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. I shone my flashlight around, my pulse racing. "Do you see that?" Holden whispered, pointing to the base of one of the trees. I followed his gaze and froze. The bark was slick with a dark, viscous substance that looked disturbingly like blood. My flashlight caught something else, a face, pale and contorted, embedded in the trunk. Its mouth was open in a silent scream. "Jesus Christ," I gasped, stumbling back. Holden's grip on my arm was like a vice. "We need to go. Now." We turned and ran, the forest seeming to shift around us. The path we'd taken was gone, replaced by an endless maze of trees. My lungs burned as we pushed forward, the sound of screaming returning with a vengeance. It was louder, closer, as if the forest itself was alive and furious. "We're going in circles," Holden shouted, panic lacing his voice. I didn't respond. My flashlight flickered, then went out, plunging us into darkness. I felt Holden grab my arm again, pulling me along as we stumbled blindly through the night. Finally, we broke into a clearing, collapsing to the ground in exhaustion. The screams had stopped, replaced by the sound of our ragged breathing. When I looked up, my stomach dropped. We were back at our campsite, but it wasn't the same. The fire was out, the tents were torn, and the trees around us seemed closer than before. One of them had a face embedded in the bark, its eyes locked on me. Holden's voice trembled. "We can't leave, can we?" I shook my head, too terrified to speak. The forest had marked us, and the screaming trees wouldn't let us go. The next moments blurred into chaos. Holden screamed my name as the ground beneath him seemed to ripple like water. Roots erupted from the soil, coiling around his legs and dragging him toward one of the twisted trees. He clawed at the earth, his face a mask of terror. "Jack, help me," he yelled, his voice breaking. I lunged forward, grabbing his arm, but the roots were stronger. They tightened, pulling him closer to the tree. His flashlight spun wildly, its beam catching the horrific transformation happening before my eyes. The bark of the tree split open, revealing a hollow space filled with pulsating, fleshy tendrils. "Holden!" I shouted, tears streaming down my face. My grip on his arm slipped as the roots yanked him out of reach. His final scream echoed through the forest as the tree's bark sealed shut, leaving no trace of him except for the blood-streaked ground where he had stood. I stumbled backward, shaking uncontrollably. The forest seemed to inhale, a low, guttural sound vibrating through the air. I ran, my legs moving on pure instinct, branches clawing at my face and arms. The screams followed me, growing fainter as I pushed further into the darkness. When I finally burst out of the woods, collapsing onto the dirt road where our car was parked, the night was eerily silent. I looked back, expecting to see the trees reaching for me, but the forest stood still, indifferent. Months later, I still hear Holden's voice in my dreams. His laughter, his frustration, his final scream. The image of his face, frozen in terror, haunts me every time I close my eyes. I quit my job a week after the trip. Whatever fear I'd had about failing paled in comparison to the horror of those woods. I took a job that paid less, but let me breathe. I moved closer to my family, I started living instead of existing. But not a day goes by that I don't think of Holden. The forest didn't let him go, but I carry him with me. His memory is the weight I bear, a reminder that life is fragile and fleeting, and that some places are better left undisturbed. The Hollow Tree. The forest was supposed to be a break from reality, a chance to hit pause on the relentless grind of college exams. The five of us piled into a beat-up van, armed with camping gear, snacks, and just enough optimism to ignore the dark clouds on the horizon. Morrow Woods wasn't our first choice, but it was close enough to campus and remote enough to feel like we'd left the world behind. I was the last one out of the van, juggling my backpack and a water bottle as I stumbled onto the muddy trail. Olivia, our de facto leader, was already waving a map at us like she knew what she was doing. Mark and Rachel, the couple of the group, were laughing at some private joke, and Tyler, the quiet one, brought up the rear, earbuds firmly in place. "Come on, Katie," Olivia called, her voice cutting through the humid air. "This way? We'll set up camp before it gets dark." I hurried to catch up, my nerves on edge despite the supposed serenity of the woods. Morrow Woods had a reputation: whispers of disappearances, strange sounds at night, and trees that screamed. I'd brushed it off as local superstition, but now, with the towering trees closing in around us, I wasn't so sure. Jack's voice echoed in my head as I walked. "You're seriously going there?" he'd said when I mentioned the trip. Jack and I had been friends since high school, a bond forged through late-night study sessions and countless games of pool at the local arcade. He'd been the one constant in my life, always ready with a sarcastic comment or a shoulder to lean on. When his friend Holden disappeared 2 years ago in this very forest, Jack had been devastated, and I'd been there to help him pick up the pieces. By the time we reached the campsite, the sky had turned a bruised shade of purple. We pitched our tents in a clearing surrounded by gnarled trees. Their bark was covered in strange carvings, intricate patterns that seemed to shift when you looked at them too long. "Creepy," Rachel said, tracing one of the carvings with her finger. "Looks like someone spent way too much time out here." "Or something," Tyler muttered, glancing nervously at the trees. Olivia rolled her eyes. "It's just old graffiti. Come on, let's get the fire going." The fire crackled to life, and for a while the tension eased. We roasted marshmallows, told ghost stories, and tried to pretend the carvings weren't watching us. It wasn't until the flames started to die down that Olivia spotted it. "Look over there," she said, pointing into the darkness. "Is that a tree?" "Obviously," Mark said, but when we all turned to look, we saw what she meant. It was massive, its trunk hollow and gaping like a mouth. The carvings on its bark glowed faintly in the firelight, pulsing like a heartbeat. "That's not on the map," Olivia said, her voice uncharacteristically quiet. "Let's check it out," Rachel said, already on her feet. "Are you serious?" I asked. "It's late, and that thing looks wrong." "Come on, Katie," Olivia said with a grin. "Where's your sense of adventure?" Reluctantly, I followed them to the tree. Up close, it was even more unsettling. The carving seemed to writhe, and the hollow opening emitted a faint, almost imperceptible hum. Olivia dared Mark to climb inside, but he shook his head. "No way," he said. "Katie should do it. She's the skeptic." "Fine," I snapped, my frustration overriding my fear. "I'll prove it's just a tree." I stepped inside, the world narrowing to the damp, dark confines of the hollow. The hum grew louder, and the air felt heavier, pressing against my chest. I turned to call back to the others, but the opening was gone. Instead, I was surrounded by an otherworldly forest, its trees glowing faintly, with the same carvings as the hollow. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. The forest didn't answer, but I wasn't alone. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that widened in recognition. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice hoarse. "Who are you?" I asked, backing away. "Holden," he said. "I've been here for 2 years, I think. Time works differently here. My breath caught. I couldn't believe it. "You know Jack?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. I had heard Jack's stories about Holden more times than I could count. They had met in the city Jack moved to for work after college, where they became fast friends, their bond almost like brothers. Jack had spent endless nights talking about the adventures they'd had together, and the hole Holden's disappearance had left in his life. Now, standing face to face with the man I'd only known through Jack's grief, it was like walking into one of his memories brought to life. Holden's expression softened. "You're friends with Jack? Is he okay?" "Yeah," I said, "but we need to get out of here." He nodded, his gaze scanning the glowing trees. "There's a way. The carvings are a map. They shift, but if you follow the right path, you can find the exit. I've been piecing it together for years." Holden explained as we walked. "The forest fed on fear," he said, "and it tried to break you by making you feel utterly alone. He'd survived by refusing to give in, scavenging food from strange otherworldly plants, and keeping himself busy by studying the carvings. I've seen others come through," he admitted, his voice tinged with sorrow. "Most don't last long, but I've been watching the carvings. They're like a puzzle. If you follow the right sequence, you can find the exit." "How do you know it works?" I asked. "Because I've seen it," he said. "The tree that brought you here is different. It's the only one that glows like that. I've watched it pull people in and spit them back out, but only if they follow the right path." We moved cautiously, Holden tracing the carvings with his fingers, muttering to himself as he pieced together the next step. The forest resisted us, its trees creaking and groaning as if alive. At one point, a shadowy figure emerged from the darkness, its eyes glowing with malevolence. Holden grabbed my arm and pulled me behind him. "Don't look at it," he whispered. "Just keep walking." After what felt like hours, we reached another hollow tree. Its carvings glowed brighter than the others, pulsing like a heartbeat. "This is it," Holden said. "Go through." "What about you?" I asked. He hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't know if it'll let me through. Just go. Tell Jack. Tell him I'm sorry." "No," I said, grabbing his arm. "You're coming with me." With a deep breath, we stepped into the hollow together. The world twisted around us, and I felt myself falling, the screams of the forest fading into silence. I woke up in a hospital bed, my body aching and my mind reeling. Jack's worried face hovered above me. "Katie?" he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're okay?" "Holden?" I croaked. Before Jack could answer, the door opened and Holden stepped in, looking pale but alive. My heart leapt as Jack's face broke into a mix of shock and joy. "Holden," Jack said, his voice trembling, I thought I'd lost you." Holden managed a weak smile. "You almost did, but Katie saved me." We spent the next hour recounting everything. As I looked at Jack and Holden, a sense of relief washed over me. The forest had tried to break us, but we'd survived, and whatever came next, we were ready for it, together. And so, the secrets of Morrow Woods remain just that. Secrets. Katie and Holden escaped, but not without scars that will haunt them forever. As for you, dear listener, perhaps you'll think twice before stepping into a forest that whispers your name. Thank you for joining us in the shadows tonight. If you enjoyed these tales, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that blur the line between reality and the unknown. And remember, next time, we'll be waiting for you, right where the ordinary ends and the extraordinary begins. Until then, stay safe and stay curious.